Doctor. Chen stared at the pile of raw meat stacked between two slabs of bone on the observation deck table, decorated with what appeared to be strips of leather and a garnish of crushed minerals, while three juvenile Vakrian predators stood before her with gleaming eyes and chittering sounds that the translator rendered as proud laughter. "We make human food," the smallest one announced, his mottled gray fur bristling with excitement. Sarah's mind raced back to 3 weeks ago when she'd made a simple turkey sandwich in the habitat module, unaware that the ambassador's young relatives were watching through the observation window with the intensity their species reserved for hunting prey. She should have known better. The Vakrians were apex predators from a death world where everything was either predator or prey, where the concept of preparing food meant tearing it into smaller pieces, and where the idea of combining ingredients was as foreign as their 3 moons would be to Earth's sky. Now, standing in the cultural exchange center of Outpost Meridian, watching these cubs present their interpretation of human cuisine with such genuine pride, Sarah felt the weight of every xenobiology textbook she'd ever written pressing down on her shoulders because this moment wasn't in any of them. "It's very thoughtful," she managed, catching the eye of Kira, the Vakrian ambassador's daughter, who stood in the doorway with her hand covering what Sarah had learned to recognize as the Vakrian equivalent of an embarrassed smile. Kira was different from most of her species, her features more refined, less pronounced in their predatory aspects. Her pointed ears, the most alien thing about her otherwise striking appearance, with silver hair that cascaded past her shoulders and eyes that held warmth rather than the cold calculation of a hunter. She wore a fitted tactical jacket over modest expedition pants, the kind of practical outfit that wouldn't look out of place in any human research station. And Sarah felt her heart do that inconvenient flutter it had been doing lately whenever Kira entered a room. "They've been working on this for days," Kira said, her voice carrying that melodic accent that made even translator-filtered words sound like music. "After they saw you perform the food ritual, they became convinced it was how humans bonded with their pack." Sarah blinked. Food ritual. Pack bonding. Of course. The Vakrians didn't eat socially except during specific ceremonial hunts. They'd interpreted her lunch break as some kind of sacred human tradition. The smallest cub, whose name translated roughly to Quickpaw, tugged at her sleeve with careful claws. "You teach us more human food?" he asked, his voice pitched high with hope. "We want to understand humans. Mother says humans are important." He paused, searching for words. Different hunters. Sarah knelt down to the cub's level, her scientist brain already cataloging this interaction for her research on cross-species cultural exchange. But her heart was operating on different protocols entirely. These weren't just research subjects or diplomatic necessities. In 3 weeks, they'd become something more complicated. "How about this?" she said slowly. "Instead of teaching, we make human food together. You show me Vakrian food customs. I show you human ones. We learn from each other." The transformation in the cubs was immediate. Their fur rippled with color changes that indicated excitement. Their tails began that rapid swishing motion that Kira had taught her meant joy. And Quickpaw released a sound somewhere between a purr and a growl that the translator couldn't quite process. But Sarah didn't need translation for that. She'd heard enough genuine happiness in her life to recognize it in any language. Over the following days, the station's galley became an unlikely classroom where species boundaries blurred over the simple act of food preparation. Sarah demonstrated sandwich making with painstaking detail, explaining the concept of complementary flavors, textures, and temperatures. The cubs watched with predatory focus, but now Sarah understood. It wasn't aggression, it was how they showed attention, how they honored what they considered important. In exchange, they showed her the Vakrian practice of meat sculpting, where the arrangement of food told stories about the hunt, the hunter, and the honor given to the prey. It was beautiful in its own way, a culinary tradition that spoke of respect and gratitude rather than simple sustenance. Kira observed from the sidelines, occasionally correcting translation errors or explaining cultural nuances that even the advanced AI couldn't capture. "When Quickpaw arranges the meat in a spiral," she explained one afternoon, standing close enough to Sarah that their shoulders almost touched, "he's telling the story of a successful hunt where the prey led the hunter on a long chase. It's his way of saying he respects how hard you're working to teach them." Sarah turned to look at Kira. Really, look at her, past the pointed ears and silver hair, and into those expressive eyes that held depths of understanding. "And what story would you tell?" she asked quietly. Kira's expression shifted, vulnerability replacing diplomatic composure. One about a bridge, she said. About two different worlds trying to meet in the middle, and how terrifying and wonderful that can be. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to voice. The relationship between humans and Vakrians was still new, still fragile. The alliance had been forged out of mutual necessity when the Crover swarm threatened both their territories, but trust was harder to build than treaties. Sarah represented humanity's attempt to understand these former enemies. Kira represented her people's hope that they could be seen as more than monsters. And somewhere in the space between duty and desire, something genuine had taken root. The breakthrough came during the third week, when Quickpaw presented Sarah with a sandwich he'd made entirely on his own. It wasn't perfect. The bread was slightly compressed from his claws. The vegetables were arranged with geometric precision that spoke more to Vakrian aesthetics than human ones. And he'd included a type of cured meat from his homeworld that smelled like thunderstorms and tasted like spiced leather. But when Sarah took a bite and watched his entire body tense with anticipation, she understood. This wasn't about food anymore. This was about a young Vakrian cub believing that two species could share something meaningful. It's delicious, Quickpaw, she said, and meant it in ways that transcended flavor. The cub's joy was incandescent. But not everyone at Outpost Meridian shared the cub's enthusiasm for cross-species friendship. Commander Harding had made his position clear from the beginning. Vakrians were predators, humans were prey, and no amount of sandwich making would change biology. When footage of the cub's human food experiments began circulating through the station's social networks, his complaints reached the administrative level. This is a military outpost, not a cultural center, he argued during an emergency meeting that Sarah was summoned to attend. Dr. Chen is here to study them, not play house with their whelps. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She'd dealt with men like Harding before, men who saw everything through the lens of conflict and hierarchy. But before she could formulate a response that wouldn't end her career, Kira stepped forward. She'd been standing in the back of the room, officially present as a diplomatic observer. But now she moved with the fluid grace that reminded everyone present exactly what kind of predator the Vakrians were when they chose to be. Commander, Kira said, her voice carrying a harmonic undertone that Sarah had learned indicated barely controlled emotion. Perhaps you don't understand what Dr. Chen has accomplished. For the first time in Vakrian history, our young are looking at another species and seeing potential pack members instead of prey or threats. Do you understand how revolutionary that is? How impossible that should be? Harding didn't back down. I understand that we're teaching our potential enemies our weaknesses. No, Kira said, and now her voice carried the full weight of her authority as daughter of the High Ambassador. You're teaching our children that humans are worth protecting, that they're worth dying for if necessary. Because that's what pack means to us, Commander. It means family. The room fell silent. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known the cultural implications of the cub's adoption of human customs, but hearing Kira articulate it so plainly made everything suddenly, startlingly real. These cubs weren't just learning to make sandwiches. They were being culturally imprinted to see humans as part of their social group. In a species where pack loyalty was the highest virtue, where Vakrians would fight to extinction to protect their family units, this was. You're creating hybrid children, Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical force. Not genetically, but culturally. You're letting them build identities that span both species. Kira turned to her, and the expression on her face was equal parts hope and fear. Only if you're willing, she said softly. This only works if humans want it too. If you want, she gestured vaguely, encompassing the cubs, the station, everything they'd built together. The question hung in the air. But it wasn't really about the cubs anymore, was it? Sarah could see it in Kira's eyes, in the way her hand trembled slightly before she clasped it behind her back in a military posture that didn't quite hide her vulnerability. This was about whether two people from worlds that had been enemies could become something more. Whether the distance between species could be bridged by more than just treaties and strategic alliances. Whether the human scientist and the Vakrian ambassador's daughter could take what was growing between them and let it bloom into something real. I want this, Sarah said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating. I want all of this. The shift in Kira was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture relaxed, Her ears, those delicate pointed markers of her otherness, shifted to what Sarah had learned indicated contentment, and her smile was radiant enough to make Sarah forget they had an audience. Commander Harding sputtered something about protocols and proper procedures, but Director Park, the station's administrator, cut him off with a raised hand. I think, Park said carefully, that we're witnessing something historians will write about. The question isn't whether we allow it, Commander. It's whether we're wise enough to recognize its value. The meeting ended with an agreement to expand the cultural exchange program, with Sarah as its director and Kira as the Vakrian liaison. But the real conversation happened later, in the observation deck, where this had all started. With the three cubs sleeping in a pile on the couch after exhausting themselves with another round of cooking experiments. They're going to grow up belonging to two worlds, Kira said, watching the cubs with an expression of fierce protectiveness. Never quite fully Vakrian, never quite fully human. It's a lonely thing I'm asking of them. Sarah thought about her own life, about growing up mixed race in a world that always wanted to put her in neat categorical boxes, about the beauty and pain of existing in spaces between. Or maybe, she said, they'll grow up building a new world, one that belongs to both species. Kira reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement the way Vakrians did when they didn't want to startle, and Sarah met her halfway. Their fingers intertwined, warm skin against warm skin, and it felt like the most natural thing in the universe. I was terrified of you at first, Kira admitted. Humans are so soft, so vulnerable. No claws, no fur, no natural weapons. I thought you'd be easy to break. And now? Sarah asked, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of Kira's hand. Now I think humans might be the strongest species I've ever encountered, Kira said. Because you don't have claws or fangs or armor, but you still choose kindness. You still reach out to monsters like us and offer sandwiches. Sarah laughed, the sound bright in the quiet observation deck. You're not monsters, Kira. You never were. My people have done monstrous things, Kira said, her voice heavy with history. Sarah knew only from sanitized reports. Before the Alliance, during the border wars, we didn't see humans as people. We saw prey, resources, obstacles, and humans have done terrible things too, Sarah said. We don't get to claim moral superiority, but maybe that's not what matters. Maybe what matters is that we're both trying to be better. The conversation drifted into deeper waters. Then, the kind of vulnerable honesty that only happened in the small hours when defenses were low. Kira talked about growing up as the daughter of a high-ranking ambassador, always performing, always aware that she represented her entire species. Sarah shared her own struggles with imposter syndrome, with being a young scientist given enormous responsibility because she'd published one viral paper on xenopsychology. They were both carrying weights too heavy for individual shoulders, both trying to bridge divides that seemed impossible. But together, in that moment, it felt manageable. It felt like hope. The real test came 2 weeks later when the Crover swarm launched a surprise attack on the border colonies. Outpost Meridian went to full alert, and Sarah watched as Kira transformed from the warm, vulnerable woman she'd come to know into a warrior of terrifying efficiency. The Vakrians were mobilizing for war, and every diplomatic gain they'd made suddenly felt fragile as glass. We have to evacuate the cubs, Sarah insisted, finding Kira in the command center, where holographic displays showed the approaching Crover forces in red and orange. They're children, Kira. They shouldn't be anywhere near combat. They're already being moved to the inner shelters, Kira assured her. But Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand rested on the weapon at her hip. Sarah, I have to go. My unit is deploying to the second defensive line. The world tilted. Of course, Kira wasn't just a diplomat. Of course, someone from a warrior species would have military training. But knowing it intellectually and facing the reality of Kira going into battle were entirely different things. You could die, Sarah said, hating how small her voice sounded. Kira turned to face her fully, and in her eyes Sarah saw something ancient and fierce and utterly committed. I could, she agreed, but I'll be fighting to protect something worth dying for. This station, those cubs and their future, you. She stepped closer, and Sarah became aware of every eye in the command center, carefully not looking at them. Dr. Sarah Chen, Kira said formally, and Sarah realized with a start that Kira had never used her full name before. If I don't return, I need you to know something. In my culture, we have a saying, Varalian, which means a bridge is worth more than a fortress. What does that mean? Sarah asked, even though part of her already knew. It means I was sent here to build a fortress, to make my people strong against yours. But instead, I found a bridge. I found you. And that's worth more than any defensive position, any strategic advantage. You taught me that. Sarah grabbed Kira's hand, no longer caring about protocol or propriety or who was watching. Then come back, she said fiercely. Come back and we'll build more bridges. Come back and watch those cubs grow up into people who belong to both our worlds. Come back to me. Kira's smile was sad and beautiful and full of promises she might not be able to keep. I'll try, she said, and then she was gone, moving with her unit toward the deployment bay, leaving Sarah standing in the command center with her heart in her throat. The next 6 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. She stayed with the cubs in the shelter, keeping them calm through the distant sounds of combat, telling them stories about Earth, about wide blue oceans and forests that weren't trying to kill you, and cities so bright they drowned out the stars. Quickpaw pressed against her side, his fur trembling, and Sarah wrapped her arm around him in a gesture that felt natural despite the differences between them. Is Kira going to die? He asked with the blunt honesty of children everywhere. I don't know, Sarah said, because she'd learned that Vakrian culture valued truth over comfort. But she's very strong and very smart, and she has a lot to come back for. She has you, Quickpaw said matter-of-factly. She makes the happy scent when you're near. Mother says that means mating bond. Sarah felt her face heat up despite the circumstances. Apparently, Vakrian cubs were even more perceptive than human children. It's complicated, she said. Different species and all. My teacher says the best hunts are the complicated ones, Quickpaw said, with the seriousness of someone imparting great wisdom. The easy prey tastes bland. Sarah laughed despite everything, pressing her face against the cub's fur to hide the tears that were threatening. These children, these beautiful hybrid children who built meat piles and called them sandwiches, who were learning to exist in the spaces between species, they were the future. They had to be. Because if they weren't, if all of this ended with Crover weapons and Vakrian blood and human grief, then what was the point of anything? When the all-clear finally sounded, Sarah was one of the first people out of the shelter, scanning the crowd of returning soldiers with desperate eyes. She saw Vakrian warriors covered in the distinctive purple ichor of Crover blood, saw human soldiers supporting wounded comrades, saw the evidence of battle in every scorched piece of armor and exhausted face. But she didn't see silver hair, didn't see pointed ears, didn't see the one person who mattered most. Dr. Chen, a voice called, and Sarah turned to see Commander Harding, his expression grim. Her heart stopped. This was it. This was the moment where everything shattered. But before Harding could speak, there was a commotion at the far entrance, and Sarah saw her. Kira, limping slightly, her tactical jacket torn and stained. But alive, alive. Sarah didn't remember moving, didn't remember crossing the distance between them, but suddenly she was there. Her hands on Kira's face, checking for injuries, making sure she was real and whole and present. You came back, Sarah said, and her voice broke on the words. I promised I'd try, Kira said, and then they were holding each other, clinging together in the middle of the crowded deployment bay, and Sarah didn't care who saw or what they thought. Kira was warm and solid and alive, and that was all that mattered. The cubs? Kira asked against Sarah's hair. Safe, Sarah assured her. Worried about you, but safe. And you? Terrified, Sarah admitted. Absolutely terrified. And we need to talk about how I apparently developed extremely inconvenient feelings for a warrior from a species that terrifies most humans. Kira pulled back just enough to meet Sarah's eyes. And her smile was brilliant, despite her exhaustion. Only inconvenient? She asked. I was hoping for something more like overwhelming or all-consuming. Those two, Sarah said. And then, because life was short and the universe was dangerous and tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, she did what she'd been wanting to do for weeks. She kissed Kira, soft and careful and full of promise, and it felt like the most revolutionary act in the galaxy. When they broke apart, Sarah became aware of the absolute silence in the deployment bay, of dozens of humans and Vakrians staring at them with expressions ranging from shock to approval to confusion. Commander Harding looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, but Director Park was smiling. Well, Kira said, a laugh in her voice, I suppose we're making our relationship publicly official. Sheraketh Viralian, Sarah said, testing the Vakrian words on her tongue. A bridge is worth more than a fortress. Yes, Kira agreed. And we're building a beautiful one. 3 months later, the cultural exchange program had expanded to include 5 outposts and 17 Vakrian cubs. Quickpaw and his siblings had become minor celebrities, the first generation of what the media was calling bridge children, young Vakrians being raised with both species' cultural traditions. They still made their meat pile sandwiches, though they'd gotten considerably better at the execution, and they'd started teaching human children the art of Vakrian meat sculpting in return. The footage of their cooking sessions had gone viral across both human and Vakrian networks, shifting public opinion in ways that years of diplomatic negotiations hadn't managed. It was hard to maintain fear of a species when you watched their children carefully arranging lettuce on bread with the concentration of a master craftsman. Sarah's research paper on cross-species cultural imprinting was nominated for the Xenological Society's highest honor. But she found the academic recognition less satisfying than the simple moment each evening when Kira would return from her liaison duties and they'd cook dinner together, blending human and Vakrian traditions into something uniquely their own. "What are you thinking about?" Kira asked one night, catching Sarah's distant expression as they prepared what Quickpaw had dubbed friendship food, a hybrid dish that incorporated elements of both cuisines. "How this all started with a sandwich," Sarah said. "How the cubs saw me doing something completely mundane and turned it into a cultural revolution." Kira's laugh was warm. "Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest consequences. You made a sandwich. I decided to actually talk to you instead of maintaining diplomatic distance. Quickpaw decided humans were worth understanding. And here we are, building bridges," Sarah said. "One meal at a time." "Speaking of which," Kira said, her tone shifting to something more serious, "I received word from my mother today. She wants to meet you, officially." Sarah's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. Meeting Kira's mother, the High Ambassador, the woman who'd negotiated the alliance between their species. "That's significant. Terrifying is probably more accurate," Kira admitted. "My mother is formidable, but she's also the one who approved the cultural exchange program, who believed that the cubs watching you make sandwiches was worth investigating rather than dismissing. She wants to see what kind of bridge we're building." Sarah turned to face Kira fully, seeing the vulnerability beneath the brave words. "And what kind of bridge are we building?" she asked softly. Kira reached out, taking Sarah's hands in her own, and Sarah marveled, as she always did, at how perfectly they fit together, despite the small differences in structure and warmth. "The permanent kind," Kira said. "If you want it. The kind that lasts beyond cultural exchange programs and diplomatic missions. The kind that says these two people from these two worlds, they chose each other." "Yes," Sarah said, no hesitation, no doubt. "I want the permanent kind, even knowing it won't be easy." Kira asked. "Even knowing that people like Commander Harding will always see us as wrong, as impossible." "Especially knowing that," Sarah said, "because we're proving them wrong every single day. We, and Quickpaw, and all those other cubs building their beautiful meat pile sandwiches. We're proof that impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet." Kira's kiss tasted like hope and promise and a future that neither of them could fully imagine, but both were willing to build toward. Somewhere in the HAB module, the cubs were probably creating some new interpretation of human customs, building their bridges in their own innocent, revolutionary way. And Sarah thought about her quotable line, the one that would make it into history books and diplomatic speeches and probably some very strange motivational posters. "A bridge is worth more than a fortress." It was true in ways she was still discovering. True, in the space between species and worlds and hearts. They finished making dinner together, this human scientist and Vakrian warrior diplomat, blending flavors and traditions and futures into something neither culture had imagined, but both could share. And when Quickpaw and his siblings arrived for their scheduled visit, their excited chatter filling the quarters with joy, Sarah looked around at this impossible, beautiful family they were building and knew with absolute certainty that this was what revolution looked like. Not armies or treaties or grand political gestures, but children learning to make sandwiches. And 2 women brave enough to love across the space between stars. And the simple radical act of choosing understanding over fear. The Crover threat still loomed at the borders, humanity, and the Vakrians still had centuries of mistrust to overcome, and the path forward was uncertain and probably dangerous. But tonight, they had friendship, food, and full hearts, and proof that different worlds could meet in the middle and create something beautiful. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was everything.